In this news roundup of a week for 13th of January 2023, Putin's latest move suggests he's fighting a political war at home as much as a military one in Ukraine. China urges its people not to travel for the Chinese New Year as COVID starts to hit the rural areas hard. President Biden is deeply embarrassed by the discovery of top secret documents in his garage. And in this week's short thought, why responding to crises is a healthy part of a normal system. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. The conflict in Ukraine has taken a number of interesting turns this week, hinting at how politics at home is impacting decisions more than the realities on the ground for Vladimir Putin. For one thing, Russian forces made up of Wagner Group mercenaries have been making an aggressive push to take new territory in Soledar, a first battlefield success to celebrate in some time. Why the push right now? Well, maybe just because they thought they could, but on reliable reports the progress being made is coming at huge cost, with something like 500 Russian soldiers being killed every day. The head of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, declared on Tuesday that the operation had been successful. Wagner units took control of the entire territory of Soledar. A cauldron has been formed in the centre of the city in which urban fighting is going on. Well, not so fast. The Kremlin, usually not one to hesitate to claim a big victory, not entirely supported by facts on the ground, denied that this was the case. Dmitry Peskov said, "Let's not rush. Let's wait for official announcements." This came as analysts, for instance at the Institute for the Study of War, suggested that while progress genuinely had been made, it certainly wasn't completed, and Ukrainian forces were providing fierce resistance. Why the rush to declare victory from Wagner and the opposite from the Kremlin? Well, it could be the public expression of background power struggles that Putin is trying to survive. Yesterday, it was announced that Sergei Surovikin, who was only promoted to be overall battle commander 3 months ago, has been demoted, with the job being handed instead to General Valery Gerasimov, the head of the Russian army. Former demotions came after notable battlefield reversals, which this one didn't specifically. Not only that, but when Surovikin was promoted, everyone was saying that at last someone competent had been placed in the role, for all that it might be too late given the mistakes made to date. This time it seems likely to have been as much about the internal politics. Surovikin was strongly supported by and identified with Prigozhin, the Wagner Group and the aggressive brand of nationalist milli-bloggers whose critique of the war's conduct has become more and more trenchant over time. Gerasimov is more anchored in the Ministry of Defence and with Putin himself. Military analyst Rob Lee from King's College London said that Gerasimov's promotion could be a response to Wagner's growing political play, as it promoted itself publicly as a vocal critical force against the military establishment. Indeed, when Prigozhin made his preemptive statement about Soledar, he made a point of saying this: "I would like to underline once again that no units other than Wagner fighters took part in the assault on Soledar." In this modern pantomime, the Ministry of Defence said, "Oh yes they did," and said that, au contraire, its paratroopers were responsible for recent progress. Airborne units have blockaded Soledar from the north and south. The Russian Air Force strikes enemy strongpoints. Assault detachments are fighting in the town, weirdly managing to avoid any mention at all of the Wagner Group. This has been the reality for some time now. Growing tensions with Prigozhin and his allies increasingly attacking the establishment's handling of the war. That all being the case, it's not a surprise that the pro-war bloggers were not overly pleased with the recent changes. Ultimately, it's a reflection of how the political situation in Russia is factionalising more than it is a reflection of how the war itself might go. When it comes to key questions that will determine that, it will be Putin himself and no other that makes the call. Will they keep attacking civilian infrastructure? Will they call up large numbers of new troops? Will they lead a new attack against Kiev? Will they decide to cut their losses and give it all up? It's not Gerasimov, nor Surovikin, nor the Wagner Group who is going to make those calls. And there's not much they can do about a growingly obvious reality, which is that Russia's military equipment is depleted and it's facing a real struggle to replenish some of their most important pieces of kit. So Putin indulged in an unusual public outburst this week when he berated Denis Manturov, the minister responsible for aviation, and accused him of not trying hard enough to buy more military and civilian aircraft for the war. With reports of heavy casualties in recent fighting, it's hard to keep ignoring the fact that many of those deaths are associated with the use of substandard equipment, as well as the routine incompetence of the commanders. With rumours rife of an impending second wave mobilisation, it becomes a major point of failure. At what point Russian citizens conclude that this is not an invitation they are going to support with their lives. You can't imagine that Putin's mood on any of this will be much improved by the news that Chinese officials are being quoted as saying that Putin is crazy and suggesting that Beijing thinks Russia's going to fail in the Ukraine war, and this will mean that it emerges from the conflict as a minor power. It's worth noting at this point that when we're hearing about the possible bolt holes that Putin might make for if it all goes wrong for him, China had already been ruled out as a potential destination. The reason given for that was that the Chinese only respected strength and success, and they despise weakness. You might speculate that Chinese officials, anonymous or otherwise, would not be making comments to the Financial Times if that contempt wasn't already fairly mainstream within the ranks of the leadership. That is, of course, just speculation. But even so, if you had the opportunity to start 2023 as any other human being on the planet, you probably wouldn't choose Vladimir Putin. Mind you, those Chinese officials should probably have other things on their mind right now. The decision to choose this moment to go cold turkey on zero COVID has presented the leadership with a wholly predictable and indeed widely predicted problem, which is that the Chinese New Year is nearly upon us, that time what sees more internal travel, with people going back to celebrate with their families, than any other time in the calendar. The major Omicron wave seems to have likely to have peaked in major cities such as Beijing and Shanghai, at least as far as we can tell, with the absence of data from the government. But now it is making its way at some speed into the regions. That's a process that could become turbocharged over the coming week. Now, people are being told not to go back to visit their elderly relatives if those family members haven't already had COVID. Professor Guo Jianwen, a member of the state's pandemic prevention team, said this: "You have all kinds of ways to show you care for them. You don't necessarily have to bring the virus to their home." The challenge is that while all the evidence suggests that the wave of infections in the cities has been relatively severe, it could be even worse in the rural areas where more elderly people are unvaccinated and health resources even more limited. That said, it doesn't sound as though much is stopping the spread anyway right now, New Year or not. According to Dr. James Wood, Professor of Infectious Disease Dynamics at the University of South Wales, the signs are that the virus is spreading quickly. He believed that there would be no more than 2 to 4 weeks between the peaks in the cities and those that will be felt in the most remote locations. As far as the authorities are concerned, however, it's all just going nicely to plan. So much so, they've just stopped bothering reporting the COVID statistics at all, which they might as well, to be honest, because nobody, not the outside world, not the WHO, not the Chinese people, gave them any credence at all. The state news outlet Xinhua said, contrary to speculation by some Western media and politicians who labelled the recent policy shift as a U-turn, the latest optimization was a result of China's scientific assessment of the current pandemic based on prudent planning, as well as a timely response to the yearnings of the people. An answer inspired by the "it wasn't a party, it was a work gathering" Boris Johnson school of political disclosure, perhaps. Meanwhile, having made reference to the former yearning of their people to be free, it seems as though the Chinese security services have been quietly rounding up the people who turned out for the protests that made that yearning visible. People who turned out for what were dubbed as the A4 protests, for the blank sheets of paper they held up to symbolise their lack of a voice, they have been reported as being arrested. NPR reported one of the friends of some of the arrested protesters saying this: "The police need a theory to explain away the protests, and they are trying to find an organiser to blame." The police first rounded people up soon after the protests, having identified them from the signals of their mobile phones. But having been initially questioned and then released, some after 24 hours or more of questioning, police have now started going back and making arrests. And the mood music has changed, because initially Xi Jinping dismissed the vigils as the outcome of a few frustrated students. Now nationalist bloggers are pushing the line that it was all down to foreign countries influencing the innocent. Some of those arrested have been charged with the crime of gathering a crowd to disrupt public order, which carries a maximum 5-year jail sentence. It's a charge that should only be levelled against event organisers, although that does not seem to fit the profile of the people who are actually being charged. The Chinese Communist Party's security body said that it would resolutely crack down on infiltration and sabotage activities by hostile forces and illegal and criminal acts that disrupt social order. So yeah, definitely moved on from frustrated students. In the US, on the other hand, we've discovered a few things we didn't know. For instance, if you see a president lighting his cigar with a piece of paper, that paper's probably some top secret document that was just lying around the place. Yes, indeed. Democrats have learned that when you decide something Donald Trump did is so aberrant, so against the normal standards of behaviour that you're going to demonise it, make sure first it's not something that you yourselves have also done. The discovery of not one but 2 batches of classified documents left where they shouldn't be by Joe Biden has completely punctured recent Democrat momentum. Now we have the usual scene, both sides arguing that the other guy's version of the same thing was so much worse. And the rest of us can look from one to the other, wondering, surely we could do better than either of these. So yes, the Trump version was worse in one way, quite an important way, in that he actively tried to obstruct the documents going back to where they should be to hold on to them. But yes, the Biden version was worse in another way. At least Trump's cash had been kept in a locked room at Mar-a-Lago from where the former president was operating. The first batch of Biden documents was found in some random cupboard at a Washington think tank where Biden had used an office up until 2019. During the 3 years since then, who else had seen those documents? We don't know. And then the second lot were in Biden's garage next to his Corvette. Who else might have come across them in that location? Well, only a small number of highly trustworthy individuals, I expect, like maybe, I don't know, Hunter Biden, who might actually, come to think of it, literally have used it to light something, probably not so harmless as a cigar. Biden made a mistake of going off script when he was saying that he would fully cooperate with the Justice Department investigation, saying that, well, at least his garage was kept locked. Yeah, fairly sure that if you study government protocols on handling classified material, your standard garage lock will not be listed as a satisfactory and suitable level of security. And the standard line is not that reassuring. He, Biden, takes classified documents and information very seriously. He was surprised these records have been found and does not know what's in them. So who do you trust less? The narcissist who deliberately keeps some documents as a trophy and stores them relatively securely but not fully in line with the protocols? Or the guy who, while pleading he takes it all very seriously, manages to leave secret documents in places without noticing or even remembering how it might have happened? I would personally vote for neither option, but if you're forced to go for one or the other, purely on the basis of that behaviour. All those Democrats who were demanding that Trump should now be charged for his own indiscretions may argue the difference all they like, but imagine a political landscape where one side gets prosecuted and the other side doesn't. I mean, you could justify it. One version was the result of deliberate conscious action, the other was an oversight, but that wouldn't be how it looks, and neither does it avoid the terms of the Espionage Act if it's decided that Biden acted with gross negligence. and I don't see how that description could not apply to this outcome. It's not going to be pretty, and therefore the political appetite for a Trump prosecution on this charge may have gone down somewhat, which rather underlines ultimately how political the whole process was in the first place. If, heaven forbid, we are to be subjected to a rerun in 2024 of the 2020 presidential election, well, at least we won't see one line of attack that previously would have been guaranteed. We won't see attacks on Trump as being untrustworthy with America's secrets, made against him by, the guy who kept a box marked top secret next to his car. As always, whether that's a bonus or a tragedy depends on where you sit. There's a growing body of research on aging and longevity that suggests your body lives longer if it's regularly under a certain amount of stress, the sort of stress that gets produced if someone is on a fasting diet, for instance, or when somebody's exposed to extreme cold for a short period. Why? Because at a cellular level, a bit of adversity pushes your cells to hunker down resources in order to survive. Maybe so it is with larger systems. The West was generally degrading until the Ukraine war shocked it back to sobriety, for instance. Maybe something similar is going to happen with American democracy, which is certainly facing a crisis point. Maybe it takes such a crisis point on a regular basis. It's what prompts us to invest in repair and renewal. Now, that said, you can easily point to instances where the crisis came and such renewal did not happen. We tend to look at degradation and decline and presume that it's going to proceed inexorably to the sad conclusion, and that's because sometimes it does. Civil wars do happen after all, systems do break down. The truth is that it remains a choice whether we respond to the crisis or not. Whether we take it seriously, whether we can be bothered to fight to protect what's about to be lost. It's funny, there's been quite a bit of talk about Thomas Malthus over the last couple of weeks, since the modern equivalent of Malthus, Paul Ehrlich, was featured on some TV show repeating doom-laden warnings that he's become famous for. The line goes, "These doomsayers have always been wrong in the past, so they must be wrong now." Generally, my advice is to be suspicious of blanket statements that have the word always in them. The truth is that Malthus and his successors were right if you took their words as what would be a likely consequence of the then status quo. And it happened again since. In the early 20th century, the falling fertility of the land was a real crisis point. Artificial fertilizers saved us there. In the mid-20th century, India and other parts of Asia faced a real food crisis, the Ehrlich crisis. The Green Revolution saved them. Now, what happened in those cases? There was a real crisis. People who understood that there was a serious problem to be solved put urgency and application into solving it. Now, the people today who simply say, well, these people are always wrong, these predictions never happen, these are not expressions of optimism on the basis of the process that got us through those early ones. They are calls to complacency. They see the crisis. They're not motivated to respond. They just think we'll muddle on through, and therefore they are not voices to listen to. By all means, carry the optimism that says you have the capacity to overcome the challenges that we will collectively face. But recognise that capacity is only realised when you choose to respond to the challenge with urgency and seriousness. Do that and you're likely to be able to solve the problem. And of course, when you do, recognise there will be some who will conclude there was never a problem at all, rather than giving the credit to those who actually solved the problem. Just bear in mind, we end up in civil wars and in the difficult times precisely when the voices for complacency hold sway, persuade us that there's nothing here worth fighting to preserve. Having failed to respond early to an obvious pending crisis, inaction gives us a bigger consequential crisis that can no longer be ignored. Expect adversity and respond. It's a normal part of maintaining a healthy system. All right, I asked the question this week whether people agreed I should do a deep dive on the question of whether COVID vaccines are leading to large amounts of myocarditis. Over 500 people voted and said yes in a percentage of 77 to 23%. So I'll be working on that, aiming for next week if I can pull it together in that time. Also, having done a string of Patreon-only Q&A videos last month, I'm going to throw it open for the next one to any and all commenters to this video. If you have a question you'd like to have discussed, add a comment below starting with the word question in all caps, so it's easy even for someone like me to spot. Basic rules are that shorter questions rather than long essays will be preferred, and I can't do original major research to answer questions for a Q&A. I will be back to Patreon-only Q&As next time because, of course, I want to be able to thank the people who make this channel possible in whatever ways that I can. As you know, I couldn't keep this channel going without that group. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.